Hello everybody, and today we are going to go over what I read in the month of July and August. I've been procrastinating on this video because typically I like to talk about my books just as I finish them, and I did not do that in the month of July. Well, I did in July, but I have a vlog for that. And in the month of August I didn't do it at all, and I feel like for some of these books I've forgotten what they were about. But so here we go, let's try and give you some idea about the status of my reading, I guess. I don't actually remember at what amount of books I started off in the month of July, but that will be on the screen for you guys at this point in time. And then as always we'll be subtracting and adding, I guess, towards the very end, the amount of books that I read. So July and August are both readathon months. In July I had my own readathon going on, Game Night-a-thon, which I had a really big blast with. And the month of August is the month of the magical readathon. So for July, I'm not gonna remember what prompts these all fit. I hope that was in my vlogs, but I don't even remember whether that was the case. So we're just gonna go through the books. And so I read 15 books in the month of July. So let's see how many of those actually came off of my TBR. So the first thing that I read, oh no, it's the opposite direction. So the first thing that I finished was Kai by Vaishnavi Patel. This was a book that I had started in the month of June. I just wasn't able to finish it, and I read the final, like, I don't know, 100, 200 pages of it in the month of July. This is a myth retelling of the Ramayana, so it's an Indian myth. We're following the character of Kai, who is very much seen in a negative light, I think, in the Ramayana, and so we're reimagining this story from her perspective. I quite enjoyed this one, though I will say that it's definitely not one that's left like a lasting impression on me at this point in time. And I wasn't all that sure about like the perspective that we're looking at it from, which I kind of feel like is the case with a lot of these myth retellings. You know, we're always looking at these perspectives from a modern day view, and so we're making them much more modern. We're making their mindset fits the mindset of us modern readers, and I'm not always sure that I enjoy that because I'm always kind of wondering, like, but is that really what's a woman in those days would be thinking about, for example? So I remember enjoying it. I don't remember more about my feelings about it at this point in time. I guess you should watch my first vlog for Game Night-a-thon if you want more of my opinions about it. What I definitely enjoyed more than that one was The Black Coast by Mike Brooks. This was another book that I had already started before the month. And so this is another fantasy book, probably somewhat like high fantasy, let's say, and we are looking at this town that for all of its history has basically known raiders to kind of come across the sea every once in a while and try to raid their settlements. However, this year when the raiders come, they have no intention of actually like raiding and moving out again. They want to settle in this town. They make an agreement. They come to an agreement, but it is of course a sort of like tense situation with the kind of peaceful settlement between these two groups being at jeopardy all the time, because these are people with very different views on the way of life, with very different ways of living. You know, the raiders have always kind of like taken what they needed rather than really sustaining a life in one place. So it is about kind of the compromise that these two groups have to come to in order to understand one another and be able to create a town that is beneficial to both of them, and that is better because of the presence of both of these groups. So I really enjoyed this one, especially because of that sort of like completely different storyline than I've seen in many other books, because of it really looking at kind of like a compromise. I feel we are always looking at a conflict, and there is definitely conflict later within the story as well. And of course, as I indicated, this whole sort of idea of coming together despite like very differing opinions definitely has its conflicts a lot of the time as well. But I thought it was very interesting to have this type of storyline where you're not looking at like a trying to keep conquerors out or two groups clashing with one another, but you have two groups trying to make it work together. So I I really enjoyed that. I really look forward to picking up the second one at some point. But yeah, there's a video that will come out which has me talking about my progress with series, and I don't tend to do very well with them apparently. Third book that I love, that I read, is Love in a Big City by Sang-Young Park. So this is a book translated from Korean. I don't remember much about this one, unfortunately. It is a queer book, but yeah, for me this one is just one that I enjoyed. I remember that, but it's not one that's like stood out to me at all, which is clear from the fact that I don't even have anything to say to you about it anymore. I really don't remember a thing about it anymore. So unfortunately that one didn't make a lasting impression. Next we get to Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is the only book of which I really remember what the prompt was, because this is my cannibalism book. Now this does not heavily feature cannibalism, and I'm a little bit sad that I filled in the cannibalism prompt with something that isn't predominantly cannibalism. So if I do next round, I need to make sure that I have some cannibalism books like on the back burner for that particular occasion. But so Parable of the Sower is a post-apocalyptic book in which we're following this young girl who has this sort of like over empathetic power, basically, like she really feels the pain of other people, and so it is kind of debilitating, especially considering this is a tough world where each stands in their own, and like you cannot show weaknesses because, you know, then people will just prey upon you. I don't really remember the specifics of like what happened in this world to kind of create the situation where we're in now, but it's definitely a type of situations where like groups coming together, working together has become very rare. It's more of an each on their own type of world, and they've kind of been living in this sort of like utopia for this world, in this sort of situation that is very rare and quite safe and stable, but things happen throughout the book. Next up we get to the big no-no of the month of July, the book that took me way longer than it should have, which is The Martian by Andy Weir. And actually in the end I ended up listening to it on audiobook just to be able to finish it. So first off, I have to say, I love the movie The Martian. I love it. I love the movie The Martian. I had such a great time with that book, with that movie. And so, was I hoping to like this book? Yes. But this is my second Andy Weir. I have previously tried Project Hail Mary and I've DNF'd that. And if it hadn't been that I needed the amount of pages for the space that I was trying to fill, I would not have finished this neither. I don't know, there's just something about Andy Weir's writing that just does not work for me. There's just too much science in it, I guess. Whereas like in the movie, it is digestible, let's say it like that. You know, I don't need to fully understand every second of his sort of like research to be able to like it, and a movie kind of makes it more palpable, or makes it easier to digest because you're seeing things while explaining as well. So you can put so much more information in a short frame of time that is still processable by the consumer versus a book. And especially when it comes to like the style of it, I also don't necessarily like it all that much. It's got like these dialogue entries, and I feel like these dialogue entries, they are used in a movie as well, and that works, but in a book you're constantly, you have one diary entry, it ends, you read the next one, and a lot of these diary entries would just end with him being like, I have no idea how I'm gonna get out of this. And then the next diary entry, which is just like 2 rows down, is like, figured out how to solve it. And it's like, fine. Like, it's as if no time has gone past. And of course, if you look at like the timestamp or something like that, you know that time has passed. But a movie can kind of make you at least feel more of that sort of effort that went into it. And a book could also do that if it's written in a different way, if it's not like in log files, if it's just done with descriptions in between. And this just didn't work for me for that reason. The humor, while I love the humor in the movie, in the book, and I guess of course it was not new for me, so that also that also worked to its detriments. And then there are bits, and then like in the movie, bits of this are taking place on Earth, and those are actually my favorite bits. So have I actually explained what The Martian is about? No, but it's about this guy who goes on a mission with like 6 astronauts in total, I think they are, and then on Mars something goes wrong, and he is thought to be dead and abandoned on the planet. However, he did not die, and now he has to survive up until the time in which the next mission will land on Mars and try to make it off of the planet together with those guys at that point in time. Next up, this book is in my pile. Sorry, Fate. Next up we have The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida by Shehan Karunatilaka. I still don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. So this is a Sri Lankan book. It is speculative, I just want to call. It is kind of like, it's literary fiction with a fantasy edge to it. So we're looking at this guy who has passed away. He's kind of in sort of like the purgatory of this world, let's say. And he's given he's kind of going through the process of moving on. However, something is holding him back. Some voice, in this case an actual character, is trying to kind of pull him back and be like, you want to figure out what happened to you. I'm really vague on what actually was the plot again of this one. And so he has 7 moons in which to basically stay in purgatory and still move on to the life beyond that. Or afterwards, I think he will be stuck in purgatory, I think so. And so this one, it's difficult. I really wanted to like this one a lot more than I did. This is also queer. It's very weird, but that typically would be for me. It is kind of verges on that magical realism, though it's very much not magical realism because it's clearly very much into the speculative aspect of things. But for some reason I didn't connect to this book, and I kind of want to give this one a second go and go in with the audiobook from the beginning. I in the end switched to the audiobook at some point because I was just having too much difficulty getting like through it, and once I switched to the audiobook I really enjoyed the sort of atmosphere that the audiobook helped me get into with this book. So this is one that I would actually like to retry at some point with the audiobook. Next up we have So Lucky by Nicola Griffiths. This is a very short book, and it's kind of like autobiographical, I want to say. Or is it a now I'm not anymore sure. Yeah, I think it is kind of autobiographical, but it's definitely fiction, right? And so it's about a woman who basically has a life sorted out until she is diagnosed with MS, and it's so basically about the consequences of that, not just for like her and the way that she is living her life, but also for how others react to her position. For example, how her workplace reacts when they find out that she has MS. And I've forgotten much about it, I will admit, once again. This is a book that I was gifted by Daniela from Only for a Page. I remember really liking it. It's a very nice read if you are interested in reading more disabled narratives, or if you've never read a disabled narrative, for example. This can be very eye-opening for the experiences that people might go through once they have been diagnosed, and coming to terms with that new reality. Next, I reread Fate of the Fallen by Cal Kate. I re-listened to this on audiobook. This is the first in the Shroud of Prophecy series. I very much adore Cal Kate's other series, King's Dark Tidings, which is also still ongoing, and that was self-published. This is her first traditionally published series. It's less of a favorite of mine, but this first book definitely I did enjoy a whole ton. It's basically kind of subverting the chosen one trope. So basically our protagonist is the best friend of the chosen one. He has no idea that his friend is the chosen one at all, but very early on in the book he discovers this. And so when his best friend is about to set out into worlds to try and like complete his quest, he decides to tag along, and they haven't made it all that far when his best friend is actually killed. And so with the chosen one gone, does this mean that the fate of the world is now sealed and that everybody is doomed, or is there an alternative possible? It's very much more like funny, light fantasy. It's very much more sort of like a funny, light-toned fantasy, and I just always like Kate's protagonist. I will say that, like, what is his name? Aslo. Aslo is kind of, in many regards, a reincarnation of the protagonist of her self-published series, with a completely different backstory. But like, you definitely see the same sort of like values and humor and interactions happening with this character compared to Raskin in King's Dark Tidings. But as I said, I love King's Dark Tidings, so I don't necessarily mind. Then we have one that's a little bit of a, then we have another like disappointment to some extent, and that is A Dowry of Blood by S.D. Gibson. So this is the reimagining of, it's a reimagining of Dracula. We're looking at basically the people closest to Dracula, so Dracula's brides, and it's very much about the sort of like toxic relationship that Dracula maintains with them, and the way that he basically keeps them under his control, the way that he dominates them and kind of stifles them, and so it's a lot about toxic relationship, and so yeah, it's telling a story about a toxic relationship through the lens of this paranormal story, but I guess I would have enjoyed it a little bit more if it just was a little bit more sort of like, I don't know, I really don't know. Like, the writing also didn't really work for me, because the writing was also a little bit too sort of like elaborate, and whereas I really like my writing more simple and to the point and like, you know, precise, whereas this kind of like feels overly embellished for me from time to time. So this one just like, especially because of the writing, I guess, didn't really fully grab my attention. Then we have a collection of short stories, which is called Terminal Boredom by Izumi Suzuki, and I've forgotten every single one of these short stories. Absolutely have no memories about these. I think, yeah, isn't it the first one is something with like, I cannot say this, especially not since I'm not entirely sure about it, but it sometimes takes the absurd to extremes, or it kind of takes cases really literal. Like, if we would refer to something by a different name, then it would literally use that, it would literally transform that thing into that other thing that we name it by, that's super vague. And there are many cases, and I think that there were also a few cases in this short story collection where you kind of fear that it will go in one direction, and then like at the very last minute it kind of subverts your expectation, and in that process, of course, showing you how well established certain of these storylines that we are imagining in our head are, how often we hear of these narratives, or how normal we in this lead up would expect this to be the case, whereas we can also kind of go about things differently, where a story doesn't always have to go to those dark places. But I think that, yeah, overall, those super vague thoughts are all I can give you about this collection, because I barely remember anything at all. Next up we have one that really, I don't know why I wanted to read it, but I definitely had another expectation from this, and this is A Short History of Spaghetti with Tomato Sauce by Massimo Montanari. So this is a non-fiction about the history of this classic of Italian cuisine, which was interesting, but I had expected it to be fun as well, and it wasn't. It really was just like dry history explanation, and it kind of indicated like that it was going to go into how cuisine kind of is integrated into a nation's history and is more than just like something you use to feed a body. And so I was just expecting more of sort of like, I don't know, the way in which this dish got integrated into Italian like identity, and the way that it helps like feed a culture, I guess. And there was like, that was promised to me, but I don't feel like it did anything with that, or not what I expected it to do. At least I expected it, it's like it ended very abruptly for me, because I expected at the end for it to kind of give a whole, like, to really go into that aspect of things, and I felt like it didn't at all. So yeah, that one was quite of a letdown, but luckily it was also very short. And then probably maybe one of my biggest successes here is Chouette by Claire Oshetsky. So this is a book about a woman who gets pregnant, and she's convinced that she is pregnant with an owl baby. And as you read on, it's very clear, it becomes very clear that this owl baby is a metaphor for a disabled child. And so it talks about the hardships, but also the joys that she experiences in being a parent to a disabled child, but also about like the reactions of others to this situation. First, the sort of like disbelief when she, while being pregnant, says that it's gonna be an owl baby, and the sort of sense of people that she's just like imagining the worst, but also the difficulty people have of knowing how to deal with her and the owl baby once they are there. The metaphor is there, but if you like take it literally, then you know this is definitely not going to be a book that you enjoy, because there are definitely certain scenes that, if literally linked to disability, you're like, what? Sorry, what? So I think it's a nice metaphor to establish sort of like a framework to look at disability, but it does not mean that the entire storyline or the metaphor needs to be taken through the entire storyline and kind of taken literally as always being the case that, okay, this is a literal replacement of the term disabled with owl baby. There are definitely things that are happening that are much more, that go much more into like magical realism later on within the storyline, for example. But I really enjoyed this one, and it was like I flew through it because I just really was very engrossed in this one. Same for the next one, which is Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. This is of course a very short one, it's just like some 90 pages or something like that. And we're looking at Nnedi, who is kind of running away from her home planet in order to join this sort of academy that her family doesn't approve of her joining. However, on the way there, things go wrong. And I love this one just for how much it also talked about identity and about, you know, the place you come from, you know, the planet that she comes from, the culture that she comes from is an integral part of her identity and who she is. And apparently this makes her very much an outsider when she comes to this, and apparently this makes her very much an outsider when it comes to the people in the planet that she's moving to, for example. But I loved how it embraces her, the way that she is different, and how it embraces like the idea of embracing your heritage. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I do want to continue because there are other novellas within this series, and then I will reread it to be sure of everything that happened in it again. I kind of remember certain scenes, but you know, it's very short, so I can easily reread, of course. Definitely one that's more there just for the page count is The Book Cat by Polly Faber, which is only 144 pages. This is just a middle grade, I guess, book about cats. It's very sort of like light, it's very cozy. It's basically 4 stories, I believe, and sort of like the guiding principle, or like the guiding character here is this cat who is referred to as the book cat, who in the first story I think makes kind of takes residence in the office of Faber Publishing House, and kind of throughout some of these other stories is trying to find jobs, because he considers his work at the publishing house to be his job, and so he's trying to find jobs for a lot of the kittens who have lost their parents during the war. So this is taking place in the Blitz. And then the final book for the month of July is Greek Lessons by Han Kang, which kind of unfortunately, I guess, leans closely to The Vegetarian by Han Kang, in the sense that I'm not fully sure what I made of this book. I know that I enjoyed the ride, I enjoyed the experience, I enjoyed the writing, the imagery that this book put in me, but can I say I like this book or I love this book? No, like The Vegetarian, I'm left with feelings that I'm unsure of how to process. So in this one we're looking at two characters. One is a woman who has gone mute at some point in time, and the other is her Greek teacher who has a sort of condition which means that he will be losing his eyesight, and both of them are these, and we're kind of looking at both of them and their history, and also the way in which they gravitate towards one another. That's saying much, because it's not necessarily the case that they are interested in each other, because it's not necessarily the case that they become best friends throughout the book or something like that, but there definitely is some sort of a weird understanding of one another that forms throughout the story. Yeah, I cannot give you more about this. But so that's it for July.